Shift our focus now to Michigan, where NBC News projects Democrat Elisa Slotkin has won the state's open Senate seat. But that's where the good news ends for Democrats in the state. Michigan Congresswoman Debbie Dingell said this week, quote, Democrats shouldn't do the blame game. They should do the what are we doing right, all of us. And Congresswoman Debbie Dingell joins us now.
All right, Congresswoman, you have just been very clear. You always give it to the people straight. So tell us what happened and what do we do going forward? Or what do people, particularly in Michigan?
Well, good morning, Simone. Good morning to everybody. Let's be blunt. And Michael, I didn't say we've got to ask what we're doing right. I said, what aren't we doing right? We got a strong message sent to us this week. And Simone knows I've been saying it for a while. We don't have the traditional Democratic supporters. We got some of the union halls back, but we don't have working men and women. They don't think that we care about what they care about is the cost of groceries. I go on Kroger every Sunday morning, and people know I'm going to be there, and they come and talk to me about eggs and milk. We got a problem in the African American community. I had a number of my younger pastors and others say, we're tired of being taken for granted. Don't come to us in October. Come. And I've said, well, I'm going to come to you next week. And I am, by the way. We got to be talking to them all the time. We've got a strong message from the Hispanic community. And Michigan is particularly complicated because of the Mideast issue, where people on all sides are hurting, are angry, are raw, and they don't know who they were going to support. And it's not one. Each of those segments adds up to a little. We didn't get as many women as we thought we would. So we got to go out and do some real soul-searching listening and be ready. So in 2 years, we can win the governorship.
And let's talk about the implications of what we saw. This from the AP. Democrats lost trifecta in Michigan, hobbling Governor Whitmer's agenda. Michigan Democrats will lose their historic trifecta after Republicans gained a majority in the state House of Representatives. Democrats still hold the majority in the Senate, meaning that House Republicans will at most stall Governor Gretchen Whitmer's agenda in the final 2 years of her term. What does that mean for Michiganders?
Well, it's not clear. I mean, the governor reached out very quickly to talk to the new leadership of the House. She will try to work with them. I think there are places that, look, I'm going to work to do this very strongly. The governor's going to work to it, where we're going to reach out and try to work with Republicans on things that matter, on keeping Michigan strong. So continuing economic development, bringing jobs home, protecting the Great Lakes and our rural communities. So some things we're not going to be able to get done, but I do think that there are places for common ground. I think that was part of the message that was sent to us this week. They're tired of seeing everybody fighting. They're worried about a lot of stuff, and they want to see us work together to get some stuff done.
On the stuff done side of it, you look at, and you referenced the Hispanic community, and certainly the African American community, and the work that needs to go on there. But pulling back, there were roughly 10 million plus Democrats who stayed home. So clearly it wasn't just blacks and Hispanics where Democrats had a problem. They still have a problem with white women, who for the third time sided with the serial sexual predator and the one who took away their access to abortion rights. So do you think there's something else here that should be paid attention to beyond, just the sort of the meat and potatoes on the ground with respect to policy? What else do you suspect is going on with Democrats that, or at least is perceived with Democrats by the broader community of voters out there, including your own base, a significant portion of whom stayed home?
Look, we had to go out and listen to them, Michael, and hear what they're saying to us. I do believe it was the economy, by the way. I just think when it comes down to it, it's economy, economy, economy. I'm talking to a lot of those women, and women's health decisions matter, but they're more worried about how milk and eggs are up and they can't put as much in the groceries cart as they want to do. Caregiving is a major issue. I'm going to reach across the aisle and try to work with my colleagues on caregiving. Child care is expensive, difficult to find. People can't find it. And senior care is becoming a real crisis. You can't find. The sandwich generation is worried about their parents and their loved ones. You can't find people to care for them. Spouses are becoming fatigued. And they don't think anybody cares. You know, we all talk about these issues that divide us. And both sides are guilty of it, by the way. Oh, we did too many bills in the Congress and gotcha bills that were title only, going nowhere. They want to see us really do something about the economy, their jobs. They want to bring the supply chains home. But and I think that's what we've got to be talking about.
All right. Congresswoman Debbie Dingell of Michigan, thank you very much. Your insights, as always, are much appreciated.
Meantime, we're going to bring in Peter Baker, MSNBC political analyst and chief White House correspondent for the New York Times, with Akayla Gardner, White House correspondent for Bloomberg, equally fabulous. Welcome, you guys. Good to see you both. All right, Peter, coming off that Ryan Riley January 6th report and how that all transpired, how it ended, did you ever imagine that we would be here post-election talking about a second president-elect Trump? Do you wonder sometimes, how does this seem possible?
Well, obviously on January 6th or January 7th of 2021, you never would have imagined that, right? He was seen at that point as finished. Even his own party was abandoning him. It felt like that he was a pariah. He was going to be shuffled off to Mar-a-Lago and live in exile. But, you know, we've seen over this last 4 years that that those assumptions were always wrong. And I think what's really striking is that had been this belief, perhaps, that historically he was an aberration. Even putting aside January 6th, that he was a fluke president. He got in on the Electoral College, but really lost the popular vote into 2016 by 3 million votes. That this is sort of an aberration and that he would, in fact, be remembered as an asterisk in history. But that's not the case, clearly. He's clearly not an aberration. He clearly does represent something fundamental about where America is right now. People who don't like him can't understand how people who do like him think about him and vice versa. And we are at this very polarized moment. You're either pro-Trump or anti-Trump. Well, for the moment, at least among those who choose to cast ballots, a majority of those people are for Trump. And I think that they've decided that January 6th wasn't disqualifying. The convictions on 34 felonies, not disqualifying. Court verdicts on sexual abuse, fraud, taxes, not disqualifying. That they think it's all part of the persecution of him, as he puts it, or they just don't think it's very relevant to the question of whether they can afford groceries or if the border is under control.
I want to ask you both about the now scheduled meeting we're just hearing about, 11 a.m. on Wednesday, that President Biden has invited and President-elect Trump has accepted a meeting there at the White House. It's only a week after the election. So, Akayla, you first. What do you think is behind such an early meeting?
I think President Biden and, frankly, Vice President Harris are really trying to signal that they want to have this peaceful transfer of power. This is something that they have talked about, obviously, for months, really casting this election as something that was about the threat for democracy. And so they're trying to show that they are the opposite of what they have painted Trump as for all of this time. But this is really the first time we're seeing Joe Biden and Donald Trump in the same room since the debate. So I'm really going to be watching the dynamics between the two. But this is also going to be a hard pill to swallow. Joe Biden really ran as an anti-Trump candidate in 2020 and again in 2024. And he is going to be face-to-face with somebody who could really be undoing some of his greatest accomplishments. So that is going to be a very interesting dynamic that I'm watching for on Wednesday.
Oh, 100%. What about you, Peter, with the timing? Does this feel soon, or is it typical a week afterwards that you'll have a meeting?
It's not particularly unusual. I think Obama had Trump in roughly the same period in 2016. I have to go back and look it up, but I think that it's typical relatively soon after the election because you want to set the tone. You want to set the tone for a transition. You want to be able to say that we believe in this peaceful transfer of power. And by doing so, of course, Biden is kind of having an implicit jab at Trump, who didn't, of course, as we just said earlier segment, invite him to the White House and didn't believe in the transition of power. Clearly, even just recently in the campaign trail, he says, I shouldn't have left the White House in the first place. He should have somehow stayed in power, even though he wasn't elected. So Biden is trying to model, as we were just saying, good behavior, in effect, to say that all the things that they complained, as you rightly said, about Trump were correct, and that they are the ones who were upholding the traditions and standards of the United States.
Yeah. Let me ask you, Peter, about what's new today, which is that your colleague at the New York Times, Lulu Garcia-Navarro, published her very powerful interview with Speaker Emerita Nancy Pelosi. Let's take a listen to some of what she said. I hope we have that soundbite.
because the president endorsed Kamala Harris immediately, that really made it almost impossible to have a primary at that time. If it had been much earlier, it would have been different. But we're not here to agonize. We're here, again, to organize on how we go forward. We're going to have fresh, new talent, perhaps Kamala among them, that's up to her, to go forward for the next election.
So, Peter, it kind of appears Pelosi is saying Biden's the one who forced the Democrats' hand. Is that your takeaway as well?
Yeah, I think so. I think Pelosi has made it very clear that she thinks that Biden has a great deal of responsibility for what's happened here, both by staying in the race originally, deciding to run for re-election at age 80, and then by refusing to drop out right away after that disastrous debate. And then, of course, as she's saying right here, by anointing Kamala Harris without opening it up to a competition. Now, who knows which of those scenarios in a counterfactual world would have produced a different result? We can argue about that, but that's where the Democrats are right now. And it's striking, I think, to hear Nancy Pelosi, who has been a strong ally of President Biden, who helped get him his most important legislative agenda items through Congress, who's central in some ways to his legacy, being so critical of Biden.
Yeah. Kayla, same question to you, your interpretation of what Nancy Pelosi is saying there, if you want to read between the tea leaves, and also ask you what you think was behind Joe Biden's very quick endorsement of Vice President Harris.
Well, I was not surprised about these comments from Nancy Pelosi because she was one of the lawmakers that took a bit more time to really endorse Harris after Biden quickly endorsed her on that weekend. And so I'm not particularly surprised there. And we've also reported that Nancy Pelosi and Kamala Harris were never that close, despite the fact that these two lawmakers come from California. But there is a school of people who felt as though that Biden should have never run again, and that possibly if there was some sort of quick primary, that maybe a different result could have happened. But at the end of the day, this is the path that they went on as a party. And at the same time, I think that a lot of Democrats would have had a difficulty running in this cycle because there was just such intense pain amongst the electorate about the economy. And Donald Trump became more popular, frankly, than ever because people remembered the economy under his presidency as one where they had more money in their pocket. And that was just going to be a tough political environment for anyone to run in. And some people have also argued that Harris did not focus enough on the economy. She focused more on democracy, on abortion, and they really didn't speak to the needs of the working class. And I think that's why we've seen some of the criticisms that we have from people like Bernie Sanders, who felt as though the party has really abandoned this electorate and has become a party of the elite.
Back to the third hour of the weekend. Democrats have wasted no time in laying the groundwork to fight the incoming Trump administration. In California, Governor Gavin Newsom says he'll convene a session of the legislature explicitly intended to, quote, safeguard California values and fundamental rights in the face of an incoming Trump administration. Over in Illinois, Governor J.B. Pritzker endorsed similar efforts to Trump-proof his state's interests.
To anyone who intends to come take away the freedom and opportunity and dignity of Illinoisans, I would remind you that a happy warrior is still a warrior. You come for my people, you come through me.
Joining us now, two voices we have relied on throughout this election, conservative lawyer George Conway, also with us, New York University history professor Ruth Ben-Ghiat. She's the author of Strong Men, Mussolini to the Present.
Ruth, I'd like to start with you because you've been at this table with us over this past election cycle, and we've talked about this Trumpism and what it looks like. Trump's wanting to be a dictator on day one. Well, America, here we are, and so I want to get your thoughts of what we can now say is the realized form of American fascism that the American people, by some 50+% decided, yes, let's do that.
Yeah, so this is, there's much to say. We are here now. Donald Trump was very skilled at conditioning Americans to think that democracy, and American democracy in particular, was failing. He called, America a garbage can. He spread with his allies disinformation about the economy, said that America was failing. and praised foreign dictators so that he could bolster his own idea of leadership, which is "I alone can fix it." And all of these slogans we've seen for years from him add up to this kind of strongman model of leadership, which depends on having an enemy and an internal enemy, the enemy within, so you can justify these kind of crackdowns on the vulnerable, these repressions, and so this is all very unfortunate. But he did a really good job of conditioning over and over. We've had 8 years of this, Americans to see democracy is inferior to something else. That something else would be strongmen ruled by him.
I'm sorry, but oh, Lord. George.
Yes, ma'am.
Just George.
Just me.
George, okay.
All right. I'm with you.
There's a threat, okay? People have been clear about the threat that Donald Trump presents. There are a number of people that voted for him. Same number right about now as last time. It's not like there were lots more people that voted for him. But the threat is real, but they voted for him anyway. Now, maybe some people didn't know about the threat. Like, what is your take on this? Because regardless of the amount of information people had when they went to the ballot box and checked that box or they didn't, the things that are coming down the pipeline, I do believe that they chose. All of America didn't choose that, but, you know, we live in a representative democracy, and this is how it works. You go, you cast your ballot, and if you win enough votes in the Electoral College, you win. Donald Trump won enough votes in the Electoral College, he wins. But there are also millions and millions of Americans, 60+ million Americans, almost 70+ million Americans that did not choose this, but will have to live under this.
Well, you've said a mouthful there. It's, I think that the important thing to remember is that only, a certain number of people mattered in this election, and we're debating about how those people move back and forth and why. And there's a lot of blame game going, post hoc, post-game analysis attacking Biden and attacking the Democrats for failing to win over Latino voters. But the disturbing thing about this election isn't new. Right? And that's sort of, maybe it's why I'm not taking this as badly as people might think. It's like the problem was we always had 40 or 45% or whatever the number is, people who are going to vote for him anyway. They may tell you, oh, it's the price of eggs, but if it weren't that, it would be it would be something else. Some of those. I mean, I think there are legitimate voters. There are voters who are actual swing voters who have been negatively affected by inflation. But let's set that aside. Among the 40-something% who are going to be there no matter what, they consume an information diet that is self-selected in a way that that is addictive, and they and this is essentially, we have a bubble around 40% of the population at least, and they don't know basic things about what Trump has done. Whenever Trump says something crazy and starts to perform vulgar acts on a microphone, they change the channel. The network changes the channel.
Talk about Fox News, yeah.
I'm struck, Ruth, by what we're seeing from Democratic governors, right? The fact that they now understand that they're going to be one of the final lines of defense, whether that is Maura Healey in Massachusetts, whether that is Newsom in California, or J.B. Pritzker in Illinois. Talk to me, right? I think we sort of all understand the problem. We understand the threat. What lines of defense are left?
I think we're going to see a lot of, courage and resourcefulness at the state level, at the local level. And there's a long history in authoritarian contexts of this. It works best at the beginning of an authoritarian, state, or when it's becoming weak and when it's fraying. But there's a long history of bureaucratic resistance inside government, civil servants, as well as, we have the tradition of states' rights, right? And this is part of what these governors are talking about. And it really exemplifies, this was a conflict of values. The Harris-Walz campaign was, joy and hope and solidarity and equity. And, you know, the Trump-Vance campaign responded with crisis and despair and extreme polarization. And so we're going to see these democratic values taken up as an encroaching executive, because that's what authoritarianism is. The executive, the personal power of the leader, wants to overwhelm everything, the judiciary, the media, the local government. And we're going to see this kind of frontline defense in the name of protecting the vulnerable. And that's going to be very inspiring for Americans. And so I'm really glad to see these people speaking out so strongly now.
So, George, Financial Times, I think, put it very starkly, talking about the Dems' graveyard election loss, noting that different politicians, different parties, different policies, and different rhetoric deployed in different countries have all met similar fortunes, suggest that a large part of Tuesday's American result was locked in regardless of the messenger or the message. The wide variety of places and people who swung towards Trump also suggest an outcome that was more inevitable than contingent. The fact is, we are where we are, to your point, is because this is where people want us to be.
Correct. They may not fully understand all the implications, but this is what they want.
But ultimately, this is what they want.
His, you know, what he was saying appealed to them in some fashion, even if whether or not they took it literally. And he, you know, Ruth is right. He did a good job in persuading those people he is the solution to problems that, you know, the right-wing media and he have exaggerated.
So what happens then when, on the afternoon of January 21st, the edict goes out from you know, Palace Trump, which will be the new name for the White House, that ICE is now authorized to start rounding up heads of households, because the idea that's newly reported is we go after the heads of households because this whole immigration thing is a little sticky politically. So we'll go after the heads of households and everybody else will self-deport, right? So there are strategies that'll start to take formation. What happens when those strategies are implemented and people start going away, when the markets starts responding, because guess what? That entire group of workers who were going to be there to go out and service this community for whatever work they were doing is no longer there. How do people respond?
And the whole effort will be chaotic.
Right.
And
so what happens then? How do the people who want this respond to what happens when they get it?
Well, you know, I mean, immigration is a tricky thing. I mean, people who shouldn't be in the country shouldn't be in the country.
Right.
And I get that. But the way that they're planning how to do this may have there may be legal issues involved in whether or not the people are given due process. But there may also, you know, there may be excessive use. There could be all sorts of issues, legal issues that are raised, and then we have to ask ourselves the question of, is this the best way to stop the crisis of illegal immigration? Mm-hmm. Is this just for, you know, these people are not, removing these people should be part of enforcing the law for the sake of enforcing the law and not to make a spectacle for political gain. Right. And it's, you know, I think this whole effort will be kind of like the wall was, right? The wall, he loved talking about the wall, but when he actually had a Republican Congress, he asked for teensy-weensy bits of money for a few million here and there, which you couldn't build a wall around this building.
Right.
And then, you know, that he went and did that for 2 years. He gets a budget that his own budget negotiators supported, and the Republicans, everybody went home, and he said, "Oh, I'm going to veto it," because somebody on Fox News, one of these, you know, these propagandists on Fox News, started pushing, "Why is there so little money for the wall?" And he shuts down the government for 2 or 3 months. This is the kind of chaos. He can't get this right? And there are going to be not enough resources to do all the crazy things he wants to do. And we're just going to see a mess. And I think one of the things we can do, I'm sorry, there's a long answer, is point out the mess, point out the incompetence. And I think we still need to talk about how he's crazy.
Right. Right.
Because that has not changed. That did not change at 2 o'clock in the morning on Wednesday.
I don't know. I agree with almost everything George said, except, and I don't know.
How did we get here?
I actually think that this deportation effort, which has real economic implications, I mean, that's what Mark Cuban was going around the country actually talking about, the effects of this deportation agenda on businesses, restaurants, so on and so forth. I think that this is one of the things that they've been working on that they could actually do. I don't know. And it's not just people that cross the border, that came in, that are undocumented, that cross the border in a way that not at a point of entry. But they're talking about people with temporary protected status. J.D. Vance in interview after interview was like, that's not something that we recognize as a legal policy. I mean, who's to say they might mess around and be like, you know what? That's Simone Sanders Townsend. She an immigrant. We about to take her citizenship. This is what they're talking about doing, taking people's citizenship. And they got a Supreme Court that says they can do whatever they want. I'm scared. Should I not be scared? Is it hyperbole? Somebody talk me off the ledge because I'm on it.
Self-examination from the Democratic Party today with new comments from former House Speaker Nancy Pelosi suggesting there could have been a more competitive Democratic primary had President Biden dropped out sooner.
Had the president gotten out sooner, there may have been other candidates in the race. Kamala, I think, still would have won, but she may have been stronger having taken her case to the public sooner. The anticipation was that if the president were to step aside, that there would be an open primary. And as I say, Kamala may have, I think she would have done well in that and been stronger going forward. But we don't know that. That didn't happen.
Joining me now, Megan Hayes, former special assistant to President Biden and former director of message planning at the White House. Good to see you, my friend. So there you heard Nancy Pelosi, and also senior advisor to the Harris-Walz campaign, David Plouffe, who appeared to take a swipe at the Biden campaign, posting on X after the election, "We dug out of a deep hole, but not enough, a devastating loss." And then he later deleted that account. Is it unfounded or pointless now for some Democrats to blame Biden for Harris's loss because he didn't drop out sooner?
You know, I think there's a lot of blame to go around. I think that there is a lot of woulda, coulda, shouldas that happened with the election, from starting from the primary or for, the primary season to when the president dropped out to the election results. But I don't think that does any good now. I think that the party needs to rebuild. I think we need to focus on where the electorate is at and where the future of the party goes, because Democrats are going to continue to lose elections if we don't listen to the electorate. So instead of pointing blame and fingers at each other, we should probably focus on what the American people want to see out of the Democratic Party so we can win elections.
Okay, well, one more pointing fingers here, because Axios reports Biden's camp is pointing fingers back at the Harris campaign for losing to Trump. Do you have any sense of what the post-mortem dynamics are between the Harris and Biden camps?
I think it'll be really interesting. I think the teams at the White House have always gotten along really well. When I was there, we worked really great with the vice president's team, at least in the communications department. So I think, I think it will be interesting to see. I think that a lot of the finger pointing and a lot of the blame game is going on from the campaign side and folks that were on the Biden campaign versus the Harris campaign. But I think the White House teams, they have 10 weeks left. There's a lot to do. There's a lot to be done. I know they're a lame duck. I know that they have less power and influence now, but they still have 10 weeks left in this administration, and they need to make the most of it. And those teams need to work together.
So in your universe of coulda, woulda, shoulda, is there anything they could have done to win this election that you think they did not?
I honestly am not exactly sure. I think that the electorate gave a mandate of where they were. And I think that they didn't understand why we're sending money to Ukraine or to Israel, but we can't afford eggs and gas. And I think that we missed the mark on the messaging from the beginning. And I don't think we understood how to communicate and how to message to the middle of the country or to, everyday people who are just trying to buy groceries for their family. So I think a lot of that is a referendum on a previous administration. And then a lot of it is not being able to explain sort of some of these bigger policy ideas and why that some of these different pieces of democracy are so important.
So the Harris campaign dedicated a lot of effort to lifting up anti-Trump Republicans like Liz Cheney. But then the exit polls show that Harris only got 5% of Republican votes. It is less than the 6% Biden won, less than the 7% Clinton won when they faced Trump. Should the Harris campaign have instead focused on the Democrats who had left the party?
Yeah, absolutely. I think we missed the memo on where the electorate was. They cared more about an economic message than anything else. And they wanted to know how Democrats were actually going to work for them and be more of the party for the working class like we've been in the past. And I think that Democrats just really missed the mark there, and they focused on things that didn't impact the electorate. And like, again, people care that they can't afford groceries and can't afford, you know, to go on vacation because they're spending so much money on housing because they can't afford to buy a house. It's just, it all comes down to kitchen table issues. And I think the Democrats just really missed the mark in understanding where the electorate was at.
I just can't keep, I can't get rid of James Carville in my ear. It's the economy, stupid, you know, right? I mean,
It
there you
always
have it
is.
again. It always seems to be. Megan Hayes, thank you so much. We'll see you again. With me right now, we have Alexi McCalmont, MSNBC political analyst and host of the podcast In Sync with Alexi. And we have Cristina Tzintzún Ramirez, president of Next Gen America. Good to have you both back with us. So, Alexi, I'm curious your reaction to this meeting that's coming up. Are you at all surprised that it's happening so quickly, or is this the norm? And I'm curious also what you make of President Biden's reaction to the election overall.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Alex. I think that it's interesting seeing Democrats, President Biden, Vice President Harris sort of saying, let's move on, you know, business as usual, let's move forward. We have seen reporting where some staffers of Harris have sort of said as much, saying that they're confused by the messaging that Trump was a threat to democracy. And now everyone at the top is sort of saying, well, let's just move forward and kind of normalize this. It is interesting that the clear threats posed by Donald Trump to the country are no longer at the top of what President Biden or Vice President Harris are saying. That said, Democrats have never been the party to stoop to Trump's behavior, to change decorum or the way that things are done peacefully and respectfully because of the way that Trump operates. And so that's certainly admirable. But I do think it is surprising how quickly it's happening.
Well, I think maybe in the shock, the aftermath, or just looking at the counting of the numbers, the votes, they won fair and square. You have to give that to them. But when it comes to issues, Cristina, as the Trump transition team, works on plans to carry out mass deportations, as he has pledged to do, we've got some new exclusive NBC News reporting that they are considering ending 2 Biden administration programs which allowed more than 1 million immigrants to legally enter the U.S. It could cause hundreds of thousands of those immigrants to face deportation if they've not been formally given asylum. So talk about the impact of that, not only for those families, but for the country as a whole.
Well, I think people have to remember that J.D. Vance has said that even Haitian immigrants that are legally allowed in the United States, amongst other groups that have legal status to be here, that they want to revoke them from having that legal status. They have questioned the legality of all kinds of programs. And then if you look at people behind the Trump administration, like Stephen Miller, who helped guide the last administration's most draconian policies, where we saw immigrant children being ripped from their mothers, raids across communities that spread terror across mixed status families, that they're also trying to stop what they call, the majority becoming people of color in the country. They want to maintain a white majority. So people have to also understand it from that lens. This, again, is not just about those that are undocumented. This is about trying to change the demographics. When Trump was in office, they also did things like say they wanted to get rid of birthright citizenship, that they wanted to change how the census was done. So whether it's undercounting immigrants and their children in the U.S. Census, trying to shift who is legal in the United States, or going after undocumented immigrants, people in the American public need to know this is an attempt to keep a white majority by the white supremacist wing of the Donald Trump campaign and party.
So that brings me to this question to you, Cristina. One of the biggest headlines of this election is Trump's gains with Latino voters, a 14-point jump from 2020. That's according to our exit polls. Why that group in particular? What did Democrats miss or take for granted, potentially? And what do they need to change in the future?
Right. I think there's 2 components. One, a lot of Latinos are immigrants or come from immigrant families. And then other Latinos have been in the United States since the United States was even a country. But what we saw, and I can tell you, I live here in Texas, where 1 in 5 Latinos live, where they made a lot of ground. Latinos, we are one of the most poor demographics in the United States. So a huge percentage of us make under $15 an hour. We have twice the national average that we're likely to be uninsured and not have access to health care. And Donald Trump tapped into and preyed on the Latino population that's incredibly poor. Now, when I talk about seeing a pathway forward, if you look at what Bernie Sanders did in 2020 in the primary, he bet that he could win the primary if he invested heavily in the Latino population with an understanding that a strong economic populist message, deeply investing in Latino media and communications could win a significant portion, that there is a significant portion of the Latino population that is up for grabs. And you can be mad about it or you can get organized about it. And I think Democrats need to get organized about it and understand that economic populism is how we're going to win this population back.
So, Lexi, white suburban women went for Republicans 53 to 46%. That is down slightly from 2020, but it's still not what Democrats are hoping for. Have we maybe reached the limit of how far the abortion issue can be relied upon to get voters to the polls?
I read it a little differently, Alex. I think that throughout history, we have seen white women siding with our oppressors over with, Black women. We have seen white women upset about Black men getting the right to vote before they had the right to vote, not so that all women could have the right to vote, but because they didn't want Black men to have the right to vote before them. We have seen throughout history, white women in particular, siding with white men, powerful white men, just so that they can have a seat at the table, even though those white men aren't looking out for their own interests. So while I do think the abortion issue is something that Democrats perhaps over-indexed on, I do argue that we have seen this throughout history. And in some ways, it's not surprising to see that large share of white female voters supporting Donald Trump at a time like this.